My name is Vanessa, and I am 27 years old. The day my family said, "We have no space for her," is carved into my memory with a sharpness that still makes my chest tighten. Because it wasn't just a sentence. It was a verdict passed on my 5-year-old daughter as if she were an inconvenience, a piece of furniture that simply didn't fit into their perfectly arranged lives. It happened 3 days after the earthquake, when the walls of my small apartment were still trembling in my imagination, long after the ground had stopped moving, when every passing truck sounded like another disaster waiting to happen, and when my daughter refused to sleep unless her tiny hand was wrapped around my finger. The building hadn't collapsed, but deep cracks ran across the ceiling like lightning frozen in plaster. And every night, I lay awake wondering if the next aftershock would bring everything down on top of us. I had nowhere else to go, no backup plan, no hidden safety net, just a frightened child and a home that no longer felt safe. So I did what any desperate daughter would do. I called my parents. I remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, rehearsing the words in my head, telling myself they were my family, that families help each other, that whatever distance had grown between us over the years would not matter in a moment like this. My mother answered, her voice calm, almost distracted, and for a brief second I felt relief flood through me. But it evaporated as soon as I explained the situation and asked if my daughter and I could stay for a few days. There was a pause, a long, uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch endlessly, before she said she needed to check with everyone, a phrase that immediately filled me with dread because I knew what it meant. My presence was not a given. My child's safety was subject to discussion. When they finally agreed to let me come over and talk, I packed a single bag and drove through streets still littered with debris, my daughter quiet in the back seat, clutching her stuffed bear as if it were the only stable thing left in her world. At my parents' house, everything looked untouched by chaos. The garden trimmed, the lights warm. The sense of normalcy almost surreal compared to the fear I had been living in. Yet the atmosphere inside felt colder than the cracked apartment I had fled. My father avoided my eyes, my sister sat stiffly on the couch, and my mother wore that tight expression I had come to recognize as a warning sign. I tried to explain again, tried to keep my voice steady as I spoke about the cracks, the aftershocks, the sleepless nights. But before I could even finish, my sister exhaled sharply and said the words that would echo in my head for days. "We have no space for her. Not for you, not for both of you, for her." As if my daughter were the problem, the obstacle, the burden too heavy for their spacious home to carry. I stared at her, convinced I had misheard because my sister's children each had their own rooms, plus a playroom bigger than my entire living area. But she continued, listing excuses about schedules, routines, privacy, all delivered with the detached logic of someone discussing logistics rather than a frightened child who had just lived through a natural disaster. My mother nodded along, adding that it would be too disruptive, while my father remained silent, which somehow hurt the most because his silence felt like agreement. I looked down at my daughter who was standing beside me, too young to grasp the full meaning but old enough to sense rejection, her fingers tightening around my hand, her eyes searching my face for reassurance I struggled to provide. In that moment, a strange calm settled over me, not because I wasn't hurt, but because something inside me hardened, a quiet shift from pleading to remembering. I didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't cry the way they perhaps expected. Instead, I simply nodded and said one word, "Noted." The drive back felt longer, heavier, every bump in the road magnified by the weight of what had just happened. And yet beneath the pain, another thought began to surface, one I had almost forgotten in the chaos of recent days. My grandmother's trust, the one she had set up years ago, the one everyone in the family assumed was symbolic, insignificant, something that would never truly matter. I hadn't mentioned it, hadn't even fully understood its implications myself. But as I tucked my daughter into bed that night on a mattress, pulled away from the cracked walls, my phone buzzed with an unknown number, and when I answered, a measured, professional voice introduced himself as a trust lawyer requesting to meet me urgently. 3 days later, just as my family was settling back into their comfortable routines, convinced their decision had closed the matter entirely, there was a knock on their door, firm, deliberate, impossible to ignore. And on the other side stood a man carrying a leather briefcase and a future none of them saw coming. 3 days after my family told me, "We have no space for her," I stood across the street from my parents' house, my heart beating with a strange mixture of dread and clarity, watching a dark sedan glide to a stop in front of the gate. I had arrived early, not out of pettiness, but because the lawyer had asked me to be present, and because a part of me needed to witness what was about to unfold with my own eyes. The morning air was still, deceptively peaceful, the kind of quiet that hides storms, and for a moment I wondered if I was doing the right thing, if this would shatter whatever fragile threads still connected me to the people who had raised me. Then I remembered my daughter's small hand gripping mine, the confusion in her eyes when she sensed she was unwanted, and the doubt evaporated. The car door opened and a man stepped out, composed and purposeful, his leather briefcase held with the ease of someone accustomed to delivering life-altering news. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the door and knocked, a firm, authoritative sound that carried even across the street. I saw my sister open it, her expression shifting from curiosity to discomfort in seconds, and soon my mother and father appeared behind her, their faces mirroring the same cautious tension. I couldn't hear the first exchange, but I didn't need to. Body language speaks loudly when truth arrives uninvited. Within minutes, the lawyer was invited inside, and I followed shortly after at his signal, stepping into a living room that had once felt like home, but now seemed like a stage awaiting a reckoning. No one greeted me, no one smiled. The lawyer cleared his throat with a calm that contrasted sharply against the thick silence and began to speak in the precise, measured tone of someone reading from an irreversible script. He explained my grandmother's trust, not symbolic, not trivial, but vast, meticulously structured, and tied to conditions none of them had bothered to learn. My grandmother, who had watched quietly for years, who had seen more than anyone realized, had left the controlling interest and primary authority not to my parents, not to my sister, but to me. Not because I was the oldest or the most successful, but because she believed, as the lawyer stated with almost surgical neutrality, that character should outweigh convenience. I watched disbelief ripple across their faces, watched confidence drain into shock, then into something darker, a dawning understanding of consequences. The lawyer continued, outlining the assets, the properties, the investments, the scale of what had just shifted hands. But one clause changed everything. A clause my grandmother had inserted with chilling foresight. Any beneficiary found to have willfully refused reasonable aid or shelter to another direct family member in a documented moment of distress could have their discretionary benefits permanently revoked at the trustee's judgment. The room seemed to shrink. My sister's composure cracked first, her voice rising in frantic protest, followed by my mother's trembling attempts to reframe the past, to soften words that had been painfully clear when spoken. My father sat frozen, his silence no longer protective but condemning. Then the lawyer turned to me, not dramatically, not vindictively, just with professional expectation. The decision, he said, rested entirely with the trustee. With me. In that instant, every sleepless night, every dismissal, every memory of feeling secondary collided inside me. Yet what surfaced was not rage, but a heavy, sobering clarity. Power, I realized, is not proven by destruction, but by restraint. I spoke quietly, my voice steadier than I felt, and told him I would not erase anyone's future, the way they had nearly erased my child's dignity. Gasps of relief fluttered through the room, but I wasn't finished. I added that while I would uphold the trust's structure, I would also be restructuring my own life, a new home, a safe one, where my daughter would never again feel like an inconvenience measured against square footage. The relief on their faces shifted again, this time into something closer to shame, because mercy without reconciliation is its own kind of mirror. I thanked the lawyer, signed the necessary documents, and walked out with a sense of finality that felt both painful and liberating. Outside, the sunlight seemed sharper, the world strangely lighter, as if a long-standing weight had finally acknowledged its existence. My daughter was waiting in the car, humming softly, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred. And as I looked at her, I understood that the real inheritance my grandmother had left me was not wealth, but perspective, the reminder that family is defined not by shared blood, but by shared humanity. Some doors close with anger, others close with understanding, but the ones that matter most close with self-respect.